Thank you. Not too long ago, I was having dinner with friends and someone told a joke. Now, it's a joke that I'm about to tell you, but I want to preface it by saying that in the moment it made me uncomfortable. And like many off-color jokes, it might make you uncomfortable too. And that's sort of the point. But I promise you, this is all going to make sense by the end of my talk, so just hang with me, all right? Okay. How do you know the toothbrush was invented in West Virginia? Because if it was invented anywhere else, it would have been called a teeth brush. When you think of West Virginia or Appalachia, maybe that's the image that comes to mind. A toothless individual, a hillbilly with a gun, or perhaps you recognize pictures like this one, which were used to support Lyndon B. Johnson's war on poverty in the 1960s. Whatever came to mind, I'm going to bet it involves some semblance of a stereotype. And at one point in my life, I also came up with these stereotypes. We have hundreds of years of them to call up on. And before I traveled into the mountains myself, I believe these stereotypes too. Because all the stories that I'd heard about Appalachia painted a pretty tidy portrait of the place. And again, it wasn't until I ventured into a region called the heart of Appalachia that my perspective shifted. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. We live in a world full of stories that we filter through our own unique perspectives. I believe we need to become more aware of how our perspective filters information so that we can widen that perspective, to become more empathetic individuals and to build stronger communities. In this short talk, I want to provide you with some strategies to help you listen to and tell better stories so that you can widen your perspective of the world. But first, we have to understand where perspective comes from. Well, it comes from our life experiences. Our life experiences have a significant effect on who we are, and more importantly, on how we see the world. And while the experiences themselves are important, it's really the stories we tell ourselves about those experiences that shape our perspective. Almost a decade ago, I embarked on a journey to learn more about how storytelling can provide an impetus for perspective to shift. And that journey led me to McDowell County, West Virginia, and work on an interactive documentary project called Hollow, a play on words to describe the hollowing out of rural communities across the country and to pay homage to the hollows, those tight-knit communities tucked off the interstate and nestled deep in the mountains. The goal of the project was to provide residents there an opportunity to speak back to those stereotypes and to create a new narrative, one that would hopefully help them affect change in their community. As a cinematographer on the project, I was given the unique opportunity to listen to story after story about life in the county, about its history, about the nuances that thread the tapestry of life together in these tiny towns, and about the problems residents there were facing, along with their ideas about how to best solve those problems. I'm just going to show you a few images from that project just to give you a feel for it. What I was experiencing in the hollows with some of the true and most beautiful people I've ever met is this. Perspective is shifty. It's always fluid. It's always moving. At this point in my life, I knew my perspective was opening because I was feeling at once both in awe of the stories I was hearing and really ashamed of the narrow visions of people that I'd held. Now, as a cinematographer and former news reporter, I spent a lot of time behind a camera. And as I was trying to think of a concept to describe this perspective shift that I was experiencing, it occurred to me that it's very similar to the way a camera lens works. So many people don't know about a camera lens is that shutter, that little piece you see in the middle there, as that shutter opens, it admits light into the camera. It also allows us to control how long that light is emitted into the sensor. Our smartphones do a really wonderful job of shooting in automatic mode. That is, the ability to control the shutter and how long that light is let in. That's all controlled for us. A really nifty tool when you want to catch a beautiful image quickly, but one that often distracts from the artistry of the shot. Light exposure, or the opening of a lens, allows us to see the laugh lines on an elder's face. the view of the moon on a fall evening, the view from the kitchen window. Perspective works in much of the same way. Open it and let that light in. The stories of people and places in all their richness and depth. Narrow it and create a shallow image, one void of the intricacies that make each of our stories exquisite. And what's more is that our stories, our perspectives of lives and our lives in the world around us, they're constantly being filtered, sifted around in our minds as we encounter new stories. In the 1960s, a scholar named Kenneth Burke also worked to come up with a term to describe a facet of the perspective shift that I was experiencing in Appalachia. And he explained his theory through a term he called a terministic screen. A terministic screen acts as a filter for individual perception and often dictates how we then act in the world. According to Burke, a terministic screen directs our attention towards some interpretations and away from others. In other words, a terministic screen acting like a lens widens when we allow it or narrows, depending on our individual personal experiences and the choices we make about what we allow to be filtered through our perspectives. Our lens colors our experiences in the world. It affects what we think about others, how we treat them, and how invested or not invested we are in the health of our communities. So it's incredibly important. When I traveled into the mountains of Appalachia almost a decade ago, I was pretty sure of what I would find. I'd read the literature and the academic papers, I'd watched the movies, and of course I relied on other people's stories about a place that I'd never been. And the scary thing is that even though I was open, I was eager, I was really excited to hear these stories. I mean, I was going there as a cinematographer working on a documentary project about upending stereotypes. And despite all that, I still harbored expectations of the people there. I was pretty sure that I knew what to expect, but I was wrong. And now I want to introduce you to some of the people and their stories, these people that I met in McDowell County. And I'm showing you this because I want to give you a tiny glimpse of how their stories intersected with mine, because I believe that this can help us see how storytelling provides a bridge between perspectives. This is Linda. Linda owns and operates one of the only food banks in the region. And when I spoke to Linda, she told me a story about how she had this dream to have a garden in front of the food bank. And she said that dream was inspired from memories she had of growing up in the garden with her father and the deep relationship that they built there. And when Linda told me this story, I immediately remembered conversations with my own grandfather towards the end of his life. Specifically, I remember a story he told me about the day he worked with his dad in the garden, and his dad taught him how to use a pony to turn up the soil. And when he told me that story, there were tears running down his face because he talked about the closeness he built with his dad in the garden. And this is Alan. Alan told me he used to be really proud to call himself a hillbilly until the day he saw a television show skit that included children with missing teeth who couldn't spell. And when Alan told me that story, I remembered a day in 3rd grade on the monkey bars when a little girl made fun of me for the clothes I was wearing, the day I learned about judgment. And this is JD, a fellow filmmaker whose courage and capacity to put roots in the ground in a community and build a business where a lot of people have fled, but where the capacity to grow is infinite, inspired me. It gave me the courage to move home and into the house that my husband's grandpa built. Now, there's so many more stories I can tell you about my time in McDowell, but I want to spend the rest of our time together providing you with some strategies about how you can widen your perspective, now that you're hopefully a little more aware of how your lens is coloring your world. Okay, so my first tip is to become aware of your lens. Hopefully you're all doing that just a little bit after this talk or where we're at. And all this requires really is to become conscious of the stories you're telling yourself about your experiences and how that shapes your perspective. And then how your perspective then dictates how you're acting in the world. My second tip is to seek out stories that are different than yours. We live in the age of the internet. Podcast, YouTube, Facebook groups, and still the best option of all, inviting somebody out for a cup of coffee or a meal who lives and thinks differently than you, and to be intentional about growing those relationships. My third tip is to always remain open and to always remain kind. I know that this one is particularly difficult given the divisive environment that we are living in. But I really think that if we are all going to give it an honest effort when we're in a disagreement to see the other side, at least try to see the other side, I really believe we're all going to be a lot better off. My third tip is to become aware of the voices that influence you. There are no quick fixes or easy answers to systematic problems. Individuals, experiences, and stories, they're all nuanced. And the beauty really does lie in that nuance. As I watched the world fly into chaos during the pandemic, one thing that caused me a lot of distress was the dissolve of relationships. The stories of family members who were no longer speaking to each other, the grief that I felt when my family members and people I respected disregarded my stories and my experiences. And again, I felt scared. I was scared because I'd almost let my urge to be right about things ruin relationships. Because here's the thing I really want you to walk away with today. Just because someone's story is different than yours doesn't mean it's not true. We are all living narratives in motion. My story does not invalidate yours. I remember that joke I told you at the beginning of this talk. Well, at the moment, I didn't say anything to dispute it. I like to think that after my experiences in Appalachia, that I would. And I hope you do too. I hope that as you widen your perspective of the world, that you find courage and strength in your own voice, that you stick up for yourself and other people, and that as you listen to and tell other stories, that you begin to widen your perspective so that we can all start to create communities where more of us feel like we belong. Thank you.